democracy. Let me move on quickly to make a few remarks about the bilateral relationship, although, as the Minister rightly pointed out, the EU-ASEAN relationship is probably the key. After all, that is the dynamic in global affairs. Bilateral affairs remain important, of course, and we have been talking a great deal about the bilateral dimension. Now, as I mentioned earlier, perception and knowledge of Indonesia in Spain is not what it should be, and the case is probably true of knowledge and awareness of Spain in Indonesia. So I think there is an enormous potential and an enormous task ahead of us to improve mutual understanding and knowledge. I am the director of an institute which is called the General Royal Institute, and it is named after the famous Spanish explorer Juan Sebastián Elcano, who of course visited the Malacca Islands in 1521 after his leader, Magallanes, as the Portuguese know him, Magellan as we call him in English, or Magallanes in Spanish, had been killed in the Philippines a few months earlier. And Spain has had a presence in the region. In fact, it remained there until 1663, often competing, of course, with the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British. As you will recall, no doubt, the Malaccas, the island, in particular the Spice Islands as they were known then, were highly valued for the nutmeg, nuez moscada in Spanish, the nutmeg which was available in that island. Interestingly though, in Indonesia this past I think is largely ignored, and our Indonesian friends will correct me if I am wrong, but the positive aspect of this is that there is no historical baggage. There is no imperial or military memory of Spanish presence in Indonesia which might act as an obstacle to strong bilateral relations. If I can very briefly make a few points about how views of Spain have developed in the past, I would argue that there have been three phases in perceptions of Spain and Indonesia. Spain appeared on the Indonesian radar in the 1970s, largely as a result of the arrival of Spain's first multinationals, some of which performed extremely well in the Indonesian market. There was then a second phase, which lasted until the economic crisis, and today I would argue we are beginning to live the third phase, a phase in which Indonesian elites are becoming aware of the Spanish economy, of the Spanish economic recovery, and the potential for this bilateral relationship. And Spain's image, I think, has been based on three main factors, which I want to mention very briefly as well. First of all, the Spanish transition to democracy, the process of democratization following Franco's death 40 years ago in 1975. Indonesian elites picked up a number of factors relating to this phenomenon. First of all, the crucial role of the King Juan Carlos, who visited Indonesia in 1980. Secondly, the changing role in the relationship between the civilians and the military, and the importance of the affirmation of civilian supremacy. Thirdly, the process of political and territorial decentralization. I think these phenomena factored in and contributed to raise Indonesian awareness of Spain. The second reason, as I mentioned earlier, was the success of Spanish companies which established themselves in Indonesia in the 1970s. Companies such as Casa Centurión, Técnicas Reunidas, and later Repsol. And the point I want to make here is that these companies continue to be highly regarded in the collective memory of those Indonesians who dealt with them. Another factor, economic factor, which has contributed to Spain's image in Indonesia is media coverage of Spain's success in winning large contracts in a number of Muslim countries. I'm thinking of the famous high-speed train contract to cover the Mecca-Medina railway. Also the underground metro contract in Riyadh, in Saudi. The Sidra Hospital in Doha. And more recently the high-speed train from Ankara to Istanbul. These are achievements which have been widely covered in the Indonesian media, and economic elites there are certainly aware of the ability of Spanish companies to win these contracts. The third factor, I think, which has contributed to raise awareness and knowledge of Spain is precisely the Islamic legacy, Spain's cultural legacy. Although only a very small number of Indonesian tourists visit Spain, I think it was 60,000 in the year 2013, the number is nevertheless increasing. And those Indonesians who do visit Spain very often do so attracted by this Islamic Muslim legacy, the legacy of cities such as Córdoba and Granada. There are, of course, problems. A study by Javier Gil Pérez from the University of Comillas, which is available on our website, has found, of course, that the mass media in Indonesia tend to concentrate on the traditional stereotypes. Sport, of course, plays a very prominent role. Football, inevitably. I hate that sport, but never mind, that's just my own prejudice. And motorcycle racing. Curiously, motorcycle racing is extremely popular in Indonesia. And two topics, nevertheless, come up. I've mentioned Islam, but also the monarchy. The Spanish monarchy also attracts a great deal of attention in the Indonesian media. So I would argue that although the economic relationship still has enormous underdeveloped potential, although knowledge of the Spanish language remains scarce, and although the presence of Spanish cultural goods, such as in the fields of cinema and literature, is still weak, there is enormous potential in this area. So finally, let me conclude by making a few specific suggestions. How could Spain reinforce its image in Indonesia? How should Spain try to go about strengthening its presence there? Well, as I mentioned, the starting point is actually very favorable. There is no historical baggage, there are no bilateral disputes in play, and therefore this is quite a good starting point. Spain is regarded as a democratic, stable, and prosperous nation in spite of the crisis that it has recently experienced. It is perceived as an advanced European country, but also, importantly, as a European country with its own cultural specificities. As in other countries, of course, bullfighting and flamenco figure very prominently in Indonesian perceptions of Spain. So my first recommendation would be that the Spanish authorities should take advantage of the fact that Spain does have this strong image, which is perceived, I think, with empathy, and in particular with regard to the Islamic legacy that I mentioned earlier. I think there's enormous potential for the development of Spain as a tourist attraction for the Indonesian elites, and the authorities should do more, I think, to exploit this. Secondly, much more could be done to project Spain's image as a multicultural, multi-religious, multi-faith society. Let's not forget that approximately 1.7 million Muslims live in Spain, Muslims from different backgrounds. And this, of course, to some extent has already been in play. In December 2010, Madrid hosted the first interfaith dialogue between Spain and Indonesia. And, of course, Indonesia has been a very active member of the Alliance of Civilizations, which, let us remember, is currently a fully fledged United Nations project. Indeed, the 6th Forum of the Alliance of Civilizations took place in Bali in August of last year. So again, I think the Spanish authorities should stress the fact that Spain is a tolerant society, unmarked by xenophobia to a very large extent, and certainly unmarked by Islamophobia, unlike a lot of other European countries, sadly. At a more specific level, the tourist authorities could do more to cultivate Spain as a sport destination in areas such as golf, which is particularly popular among the Indonesian elite, and Andalusia therefore would perhaps be the obvious destination for that. Additionally, the authorities should encourage the teaching of Spanish. Efforts have been made in this regard, for example, by setting up the Aula Cervantes, but a great deal remains to be done. I think the study of contemporary Spain at Indonesian universities could be encouraged quite easily. And finally, people-to-people relations should definitely be promoted. At our modest level, the General Royal Institute is involved in doing that, and I very much hope that we will continue to work with the Indonesian embassy in this regard. Thank you very much indeed.